All right. Good evening. This is part 12 of our series on the first chapter of Sanhedrin. I am going to share my screen so everybody can see the packet together. If you are watching this at some point in the future and you would like the PDF, please feel free to email me at deborahclapper@gmail.com. All right, so much of our page this evening is going to be tying up loose ends from conversations that were started last week or the week before or before that. And a lot of the trick of this evening is, at any particular point, which conversation are we in the middle of? So I'll do my best to untangle that. But we begin with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha saying something which seems is a continuation of the bit we spoke of last week. When we talked about the pasuk, Lo taguru mipnei ish, don't be afraid of a man. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha has another take on it, which is relatively similar to the ones we saw last week. Last week, it was about not, once you agree to try a case and you've heard the sides, you can't back out because you're afraid of one of the litigants. So this is a similar but not identical situation. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha says, Minayin latalmid sheyoshev lifnei rabbo. So how do we know that a student who's sitting in front of his teacher, and the classroom situation and the courtroom situation seem to be combined a lot of the time in the Gemara? It's not clear to me that those were actually two separate things. And it seems to me very likely that what you have is a teacher conveying the tradition to the students, who sometimes gets interrupted by people asking them to decide the law. And then the trial becomes part of the classroom instruction. In any case, so imagine that, and then imagine that one of the one of the students who's sitting there, and the student sees an argument for the innocence of the poor person and or the guilt of the rich person, and presumably the same thing is true the other way, just you'd be less frightened of intervening in favor of the powerful people. At least I'm assuming that's true. Perhaps not. In any case, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha says, Minayin shelo yishtok. How do we know, or from where do we know, that you cannot or should not be silent in that situation? And Rashi says that this is potentially silence out of fear either of the teacher, who you should ordinarily feel a sense of respect for and perhaps not interrupt him to tell him he's wrong in front of these strangers who are in the classroom, and also that you shouldn't be afraid of the powerful or wealthy litigant whose life you're about to mess with. In any case, it's the pasuk says, Lo tagur mipnei ish, you shouldn't be afraid of a man. And it's not unusual midrashically for us to read the word ish to mean an important person, as opposed to just a human of the adult male variety. Okay, Rabbi Chanin says, and he is interested in interpreting the same pasuk, Lo tachnis devarecha mipnei ish, don't hold in, don't keep inside your words because of or in front of a man. That also seems to be an interpretation of Lo tagur mipnei ish. But Rabbi Chanin goes on. V'yu edim yod'im et mihen me'idin, and the witnesses should know about whom they testify. And this seems possibly to mean something along the lines of, if I'm testifying that A owes money to B, then I am, in a sense, testifying that God gave the money to the wrong person, which is a little bit chutzpahdik. So you should, I guess, keep in mind who you're complaining about here. Just why I capitalized the W. Rashi definitely says that you're testifying about God here. V'lifnei mihen midin, and in front of whom they testify. You should also realize that God is listening and be scared of him. Umi atid lifara mihen, and who will someday punish them. All right, we want witnesses to walk into the courtroom with a healthy sense of terror. Hopefully a healthy sense of terror that will cause them to only tell the truth. Terror that, for example, prevents them from telling the truth or prevents them from showing up at all is presumably not a healthy terror. Okay.
The first part, though, is not talking. Oh, maybe it is. The lo tachnis dvarecha mipnei ish and the similar statement that we had above, is that referring to witnesses or that's referring to the people
I don't know.
Who are judging?
Maybe both. Maybe everybody. Maybe that's not courtroom specific. I don't know.
Okay,
maybe
so these are. Sorry.
I was going to say maybe in general it means that you should tell the truth, do the right thing, and so on, regardless of who you might be scared of.
Right. Then it just seems unconnected to those three statements following.
Yes. And it's possible that they're all connected because they connect to the same pasuk, not necessarily because they logically relate to each other.
Except in the latter three, they're not showing fear or anxiety related to a person.
So I think that
God.
the witnesses. So I think that being afraid of God is supposed to be a sort of protection against being afraid of people. If you realize that God is running the show and he's going to get you, then what he could someday do to you is much worse than the cement shoes that the litigants might put you in. I think that's supposed to be the theory.
Okay.
Okay. Or maybe it's not about fear and it's about God will protect you from the people who might attack. Like that would be the more cheerful version. But one way or the other, I think that they're both going in the same direction here.
Yeah, well, since the last one has to do with punishment, I'm not sure the protection explanation is what's going on here.
It could still be both. But yeah, there's definitely a threatening aspect to this as well.
Yeah. Okay.
But the proof text that Rabbi Chanan brings is actually not lo tagur mipnei ish for this one. It's Shneamar v'amdu shnei anashim asher lahem hariv lifnei Hashem. And for this, I think it would be a good idea if we look at some of the surrounding psukim. So let's take a little field trip here to Devarim 19. And we are in general in a sort of a list of things that relate to court procedure and that sort of thing. Okay, so starting from verse 15, so two psukim early. One witness should not rise against a man for any sin, or any sin that he might sin. Something will be established by the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses. If a violent witness rises against a man, to lie about him, then the two men who have the argument will stand lifnei Hashem, will stand in front of God. Now that's our pasuk. That's our quote. And there's some genuine ambiguity here. Whether the people who are going to have to stand in front of God are the witnesses or the litigants, or the witnesses and the litigants. And the Gemara in Shavuot actually decides that some of the words here are talking about the witnesses and some of them are talking about the litigants, and in fact it's both, which it seems to me is a sensitive response to a genuine ambiguity in the text.
Why? It says Shnei ha'anashim asher lahem hariv. So those are the
Right.
litigants.
Well, maybe, except that all of the people in the text for the 3 sentences before that are the witnesses.
Right, but
And they're the ones, so
it switches.
in the context of the text, it's the witnesses who are being judged. So on the other hand, you obviously can't have the case without the litigants as well. So I as I said, I think the Gemara in Shavuot is actually a sensitive textual reading rather than a forced one. But one way or the other, if you like the forced version better, technically the Gemara in Shavuot says, well, it says the 2 men who have the fight, the men who have the fight, those are the litigants, and the 2 men, those are the witnesses. So technically that's how the Midrash works, but that always feels forced to me. So,
Right.
I think that it's clear to me that the what's actually motivating is the larger context, but that's not how they describe it. In any case, Rabbi Chanan is presenting this pasuk as saying that the witnesses should be standing before God, and the context of the text is that this is somehow supposed to involve punishing lying witnesses. So presumably, Rabbi Chanan is imagining that if the witnesses see themselves standing before God to begin with, then they don't end up becoming lying witnesses.
Except that the continuation of the pasuk is lifnei hakohanim v'hashoftim asher yu bayamim hahem. So, and lifnei Hashem, doesn't that also mean in front of the judges? Didn't we
No, that would be lifnei Elohim. Hashem is unambiguous. It might mean the only other thing lifnei Hashem can mean is in the Beit HaMikdash. That it could mean, but I don't think we're talking about holding a court case in the Azara. That would be peculiar.
Right, except that it does say lifnei hakohanim v'hashoftim.
Yeah, so the Torah always seems to imagine the Kohanim as having we might call a rabbinic role. I don't know that this is that different than the other times when it says that you should, go ask your legal questions to them, or that they'll judge cases, or those sorts of things.
Right. That was kind of my point, is that it's not necessarily God. It's God through the Kohanim. That it's really what they're facing.
Or they're standing in front of God and standing in front of the judges are simultaneous, but not the same thing. In the same sense as when we ask somebody to swear in God's name holding a Sefer Torah in court, right? We can definitely invoke the name of God and also invoke the authority of the judges to make you take the oath at the same time, and we understand those are different things.
Right. I just saw it as the Kohanim and the Shoftim are the judges representing the judgment of God here. So
I think that Rabbi Chanan is going a different way. I think he would very much prefer that the Shoftim and the Kohanim also see themselves as standing before God. Right? In his mind, that whole scene, everyone is standing in front of God. It's true, you have a hierarchy among the humans standing there, but they're all standing before God. But he does use a different pasuk to prove that, which is the next thing he's going to say. Okay, so he says, the judges should know whom they are judging. And again, there's this sort of implication that they're judging God himself if they're deciding whether things are where and what and when they're supposed to be. God's the one who presumably put them where they're currently, and they're going to move them around. V'lifnei mi hein danin, and in front of whom are they judging? Umi atid lifara mehen, and who will someday punish them. The last two seem to be basically the same as for the witnesses, but they get a different pasuk. Shene'emar Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, which I translated as God stands in the congregation of God. But the truth is, I suspect Rabbi Chanin is reading it as the judges stand in the congregation of God. And it seems to, this is the pasuk that we invoke when what we mean is that God is present in the courtroom. The Elohim, the secular Elohim, that means judges, and the holy Elohim, that means God, are simultaneously present in the courtroom. V'chein b'Yehoshaphat hu omer. Yehoshaphat is a king toward the end of Second Divrei Hayamim, and he institutes some legal reforms. And what we have here is a quote from his his invocation speech that he gives to the new judges when he's trying to inspire them to judge fairly. And he says, "Vayomer el hashoftim ru'u ma'atem osim, ilo la'adam tishpetu ki'im l'Hashem." And he says to them, look at what you're doing, and keep in mind that you're not judging people, you're judging God. So that seems to be, Rabbi Chanin thinks that that's also along his same lines, that every time you issue a judgment in your courtroom, you should think of it as a pronouncement about God's world, and you should take it every bit that serious. Shema Yomar Hadayan Mali Bitsar. So lest the judge say, "What do I need with this problem? This is an interruption in my day. It is a pain in the neck, and now these people are going to be mean to me as a result of whatever I do." No way the judge comes out with everybody liking them. Talmud Lomar Imachem Bidvar HaMishpat. So that's why the end of the verse that Yehoshaphat said that was left out the first time is, "He is with you in a matter of judgment." He's gonna help you make the right choice, seems to be the idea here. Because what he says is, "Ein lo l'dayan ela ma she'einav ro'ot." The very famous quote, "A judge has only what his eyes see." And it seems to indicate that you get all the best information you can get, and then you make a judgment call based on that. And now you've done your best. Nobody can ask you to do more than that. And God is going to sort of guide your hand so that it comes out right. And that's what it means, that God is there with you in the courtroom, from both sides. On the one hand, God is, so it's the world's ultimate performance review, and you better do a good job. And on the other hand, if you do your best, God will make sure it turns out okay for you and for the litigants. Okay, so now we are totally changing lanes, and we are referring back to 2 classes ago. We read a Breita that said that in the name of an anonymous person who we've been calling the Tanakama, we will continue calling him the Tanakama this evening. We said in this anonymous name that the judges can, and possibly maybe even should, but certainly can, encourage a mediated compromise right up until the moment of the Gemar Din, the conclusion of the judgment. So now we are coming back to ask a question about that. And we are asked, Kechi Dami Gemar Din, what is this thing that you call the conclusion of judgment, the Gemar Din? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Ish ploni ata chayav, ish ploni ata zakai. So you turn to one person, and you say, "Hey, you're liable, you're guilty," and the other person, you turn to him and you say, "You're innocent." So this is what we would call in an American courtroom a verdict. And it seems that we're requiring a formal pronouncement. The fact that you know who you're planning to declare innocent or guilty is not what we're talking about the fact that you actually showed up in the courtroom and made a formal pronouncement in front of the litigants telling them what the result is. Amar Rav. So Rav also said, Halacha Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. So the law follows Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, not the Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha that we had this in this evening's sources like a page and a half ago. But the earlier one that we had, I think last week, that it is a mitzvah to compromise. But the Gemara is not entirely sure that Rav really said this. Ini, really? Did Rav really say that the law follows Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha? But the Rav Huna Talmidei de Rav. But Rav Huna was the student of Rav. And Kihava atu lekame de Rav Huna, when litigants used to come in front of Rav Huna, Amar lahu idina beitu ipshira beitu. He would offer them a choice, and he would say, "Would you like me to judge the case according to law, or would you like me to help you to mediate a compromise?" So that doesn't sound like Rav Huna is ruling that it's a mitzvah to compromise. If he thought that it was a mitzvah to compromise, then he should say to the litigants something like, well, if you insist, I suppose I shall have no choice but to offer you the law. But, you really should do this thing, which is a better mitzvah, which is compromising. But it doesn't sound like he's doing that. It sounds like he's offering them an even choice. So it sounds like at least Rav Huna, and possibly insofar as he carries on Rav's legacy, Rav did not think that the law was that you have to compromise. So we're gonna, on the other hand, that was sort of an extreme version of Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. So now we're gonna try to understand Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha differently. So my mitzvah, nami dekama Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. So what kind of mitzvah was Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha talking about? Mitzvah l'meimra lehu odina beitu ipshira beit. Turns out that we think, at least that Rav thinks, that Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha meant that you have to offer an option of mediation rather than judgment. And then it makes sense that Rav thinks that this is the law, because that is in fact what Rav Huna is doing. And it also makes sense that it would be difficult in the end to say that it was a mitzvah not to use the laws of the Torah to decide cases. That would be would result in a very strange reading of the Torah. Well, if you insist, here are some rules, but try not to follow them. Like that really doesn't feel like the pshat. So that turns out that we don't think that's what Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha means. We think what he meant was that it's always a mitzvah to always offer to use mediation, and then you offer free choice, and the litigants, if either one of them wants a real judgment, then you have to do a real judgment. Okay. Problem is, Hainu Tanakama, but that's the same, seems like the same position as the Tanakama. So the Tanakama, you'll remember, we just mentioned a few minutes ago, is the one who said, and here's all he said was, once you have announced the verdict, you're no longer allowed to encourage a compromise. So from that, we inferred that before you announced a verdict, you can or should or do encourage mediation. And at the moment, we are guessing that maybe what he meant was you should encourage mediation. And so then that would turn out to be the same position as Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, who says you should encourage mediation.
Deborah?
Yeah.
I think from what I remember last week, we didn't say that you couldn't compromise until you hear a verdict. We said you couldn't compromise until you hear the words of the litigants.
Okay, so we had three positions, and you may be right that the Tanakama was actually 3 weeks ago, or possibly even 4 weeks ago. We've been in this tangled heap of spaghetti that we call a discussion for some time.
Right, but last week, we did this okay. Last week.
So the Tanakama said that once you have a verdict, you can't compromise. Last week, we had Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, who we'll be coming back to in just a second. Oh, it looks like I forgot to expand the abbreviation of his name here. Sorry. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says that you can only encourage a compromise until you know what you think the verdict is going to be.
See, I remember.
So he's a separate position. But we have, in the end, three very, very similar positions. So similar, it almost doesn't make any sense that they're disagreeing with each other, but we're trying to, because the Breita bothered to list them separately, we're trying to pick apart exactly how they might be different.
Last week we had Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh Omer Shnaim Shabao Lefanecha Ladin Ad Shelo Tishma Divreihen.
Yeah, so I think the Breita about the Gemar Din may have been at the very end of source packet number 10, which would be the week before that. Well, I mean, not the week before, because we missed a week because of my grandson's birth, but the class before that.
Okay.
So one of the things that's going on here is that we're, as I said before, we're in the middle of like 4 different discussions at once, and we're continuing each one a little bit incrementally each time. And if you read through several hours worth of this at once and hold it all in your head at once, then you end up with multiple complete conversations in your head. But it's really too much for any normal human being to hold in their head all at the same time.
Certainly mine.
It reminds me of a roommate that I had in college who would often be, in her mind, in the middle of 4 or 5 different conversations with me. And it would often take me several sentences to figure out which conversation she was in when she just started talking like she was in the middle of something. And it's like that, except that you can't ask questions because the people who composed it are, long gone. But we're doing our best anyway. In any case, so we had asked what the difference is between the position of Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, who says it's a mitzvah to offer mediation, and the position of the Tanna Kama, who says you can't offer mediation once the verdict has been announced. And the Gemara says, Ika beinaihu mitzvah. The difference between them is whether or not it's a mitzvah. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha suffer mitzvah. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha thinks it's a mitzvah to offer the compromise. Tanna Kama suffer reshut, and Tanna Kama is offering you permission, but he doesn't think you have to. He thinks that you can offer to mediate. If you want to mediate, don't offer to mediate. If you don't want to mediate, he's not fussed. As long as once you announce the verdict, you don't offer to mediate. That's the only part he cares about. Okay. The problem is that then sounds almost identical to Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. As Mindy noted, the positions seem very similar. The difference is between until you know which way the verdict will go and until you've said the verdict. Those don't seem that different. But we're gonna try to make what we can out of that difference. Ika beinaihu misha tishma divrehen v'ata yodea leichan hadin noteh. Yata rashai lomar lahem tzu'u vitzu. So the difference between them is those few moments when you know which way the verdict is going to go, but you haven't announced it yet. At that point, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, you're not allowed to tell them, never mind, go make a compromise. But according to the Tanna Kama, at that point, you still could, even though you know what you're going to say, but you haven't said it yet. So the Tanna Kama doesn't think it's a problem. Okay, now we're going to follow a different strand of our, as I said, our spaghetti here. We had a number of different interpretations, either last class or the one before. I'm losing track myself at this point of which is which. We had a number of different interpretations of a pasuk in Tehillim, 10:3 in particular, that said, Botzea Beirech, I think it's Beirech, Nietz Hashem. A compromiser, he blesses he blasphemes God. Or we had one interpretation that actually read Botsea as somebody who breaks bread, and we had another one that read Botsea as somebody who makes a profit, Profit. In any case, we had a whole bunch of different interpretations of that pasuk. We are now going to go back and pretend we're at the end of that conversation and offer one more tidbit for that. Upliga Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai. All of those interpretations disagree with the following teaching of Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai. Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai, because Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai said the following: Lo ne'emar mikra zeh ela k'neged maseh ha'egel. This pasuk was said talking about the golden calf. And Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai never here actually explains exactly how he thinks it connects. It seems that Aaron, who we saw in a positive light a couple of weeks ago as the guy who seeks compromise, but in the case of the golden calf, he seeks compromise in a way that's wrong, and he ends up with idolatry. We're calling it blasphemy. And so Rabbi Tanchum ben Chanilai says that pasuk was talking about it. So this is how he thinks it happened. It says Aaron saw, and he built an altar in front of it. There is the golden calf. Ma ra'ah. So what did he see? Amar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefet. Amar Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefet said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Ra'ah Chur shezavuach lefanav. He saw Chur slaughtered in front of him. Now Chur was the other person that Moshe left in charge. At the time when Moshe leaves to go up onto the mountain to get the Torah, he leaves Aaron and Hur in charge. By the time Moshe comes down, it's just Aaron, and we never hear about Hur again. So the Midrash assumes that he was somehow killed in the proceedings while Moshe was up on the mountain, and that's why he vanishes from the story. So here he saw the Hur lying there slaughtered in front of him. Amar, he said to himself, Ilo shamana lahu, if I don't listen to them, Ashta avdu li kida avdu bechur, then right away, right now, they're going to do to me what they did to Umekayim bi, and then they will fulfill through me the verse in Echa, Im yehareg b'mikdash Hashem kohen v'navi. Right? Will the priest and the prophet be killed in the sanctuary of God? Now, presumably, when Yirmiyah is writing in Echa, he was at least mostly writing about the priests and prophets who had just died in the siege of Jerusalem. But on the other hand, Aaron, being both a priest and a prophet, could reasonably be afraid if he knew about this pasuk, which isn't going to get written for 1,000 years. But if he did know about it, he could reasonably be afraid that he could be inspected. Velo havia lahu takanta leolam, and this is we're still in Aaron's mental internal conversation here. If they kill me, then that can't ever be fixed. They'll be murderers forever. I'll be dead forever. There's no way out of that. Mutav leavdu egel. It's better if they worship the calf, because then efshar havilu takanta b'tshuva, because that they might be able to fix. They can do tshuva. I'll still be alive, and we can make it better. Now the thing is that it seems pretty clear that this is the wrong choice, right? This, as a conclusion to a conversation about compromise and avoiding the law in favor of making people happy, this is not a text that's super in favor of those things. This is we would have been better off with Moshe's let the judgment pierce the mountain than with Aaron's, hey guys, don't you want to be nice to each other? because Aaron's more easygoing, compromising kind of situation is ultimately, it's not just going to cause the most serious crime, I guess, of the desert era, but it also causes a huge civil war in which a very considerable number of people die. Right? It is not the case that peace reigns and nobody dies and no one becomes a murderer because Aaron made this compromise. In fact, if there had been a way out in which only one more person had to die, that would have been an enormous improvement over what happened. Now, in fairness to Aaron, if he had stood in front of them and said, no, you can't worship the calf, and they had killed him, they would probably still have worshipped the calf, and there would probably still have been a plague and a civil war. And right, like the real logic here is they're going to do it anyway. Why should I also be dead? But that's not the logic that we put into Aaron's mouth here. Aaron is imagined here as believing that it's possible to completely avoid violence. And that is tragically definitely not what happened. And so in the end, this is a word of caution that somebody who praises compromise ends up with blasphemy or, civil war, murder, death, disaster, possibly broken tablets, all the terrible things. And so on the one hand, we're having our ambivalence has not changed, right? We've now ruled legally that the judges are obligated to recommend or at least offer mediation, and possibly right up until the minute they actually announce the verdict. And at the same time, in the non-legal storytelling aspect of the Gemara is really very ambivalent about the idea of going for relationships rather than law, and really, really unsure that isn't terrible. And so that has not changed. We started out in that place, and we're still in that place after all of this discussion, which is fair, because on the one hand, law does tend to produce winners and losers, and that makes people dislike each other possibly more than they did when they walked into the courtroom. And on the other hand, we have laws for a reason, and that's because on the whole they're better than chaos. Right? So like there's something very real being represented by this ambivalence here.
But the end doesn't even show ambivalence. It really strikes me how strongly it comes out to say compromise is bad.
Well,
or could be bad, but it's so strong. This
right. So I think the word we're looking for is not bad so much as dangerous.
No, I understand, but it doesn't show ambivalence anymore. It shows real one-sidedness.
Well, if you look at the last two things the Gemara quoted, so we've got, or the last two chunks, the second to last chunk is the law requires you to offer mediation, and the last chunk is this story about Aaron.
Right.
And so this is actually not terribly unusual for the Gemara to teach something legal and then undermine it with a story that seems to have the opposite meaning.
True. That's true.
A lot of the time we read it and we resonate more with the story than we do with the legal pronouncement. Right? An example of that, a very famous example of that, is the Gemara about getting drunk on Purim. Right, where the Gemara says it's a mitzvah to get drunk on Purim. And then the very next thing the Gemara does is it tells a story about two rabbis, one of whom kills the other while drunk on Purim.
Right.
And that seems like a very similar kind of situation.
Yes, it is. You're right.
And this is a, I don't know how often this pattern repeats, but it is a recognizable known pattern.
Yeah,
where
it's common.
where the law is the law, but you undermine it with a
With a warning.
warning. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, that's a good analogy to the example of Purim. That's true.
Yeah, I don't like it as much as you do, partly because I'm actually ambivalent about mediation as opposed to law, and I'm totally unambivalent about drunkenness.
Right. Yes.
I don't really see the point. But you know,
I
perhaps if I did
know.
see the point, it would be different.
You don't have to get me started on that one.
Anyway, okay, so are there questions?
I think I've asked all of mine.
I do know a case of someone who, at least for a while, was purposely got drunk on Purim because he thought it was mandated, and did not enjoy it at all.
Well, you know, such people should certainly be told about the position of the Rambam, that all you need to drink is slightly more than normal. Which hopefully for a person who doesn't enjoy being drunk isn't very much.
Well, some yeshivot aren't that big on Rambam.
That's true. Well, the Rambam does require that you take a nap after you drink, because he says while you're asleep, you won't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. So I sort of get the impression that he wasn't so big on drunkenness either.
The Rambam was he was a doctor, right? So
That's true, but I think that in the Middle Ages there was some genuine disagreement in the medical community about whether alcohol was good for you or bad for you, as there still is to some extent.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to things that you eat and drink, there's really very little new about fighting about whether things are good for you or bad for you. We just dress it up in different language every few years. Anyway. Okay. So I believe we are on for next Monday night.
Yep.
And I will see you then. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.
enjoy.
Good night.